Hi, and welcome to the Healthy Built Environment for Health Professionals training series. We are very excited to have Mark Holland here presenting his presentation titled Health and Urban Planning in Larger Cities. I'll pass the mic off to you, Mark.
Thank you very much. It's an honor to be here to discuss this very important issue that we have in cities and planning and development today. And I look forward to looking at this conversation, this issue with you from maybe a slightly different perspective than many perspectives that have been offered, but one that I think is really critical to taking the very important ideas that are in play now in health and urban development and actually making them real in the ground. In other words, building cities in a different way than we have historically built them so that they make us healthier. What I'll do in the next 20 minutes or so is I want to start by just exploring a little bit of my perspective and why I'm taking the angle on this discussion that I am. I'd like to just briefly review the this incredibly important document that we have in play now in BC in the Healthy Built Environment Toolkit. The discussion between large cities and small towns is another one that really will shape what I talk about and how healthy built environments are actually built, because large cities and small towns are two extremely different contexts for addressing health issues. What then gets to become important is the majority of the rest of the discussion is around the way that public agencies and private developers interact, and in particularly how public agencies can lead that conversation in the public interest to drive health issues and health performance higher, and how you do that at each stage of what I'm calling the Russian doll of approvals. And then finally, just a few thoughts on my experience as a professional in this field in what it takes to be effective as we do this. My perspective, my background ranges from having started working as a city planner in the city of Vancouver, and the image you see on this slide here in the upper left is Southeast Falls Creek. I spent many years of my life helping build the vision for what became the Olympic Village and then ultimately was declared the greenest neighborhood in the world by the U.S. Green Building Council, and we got it certified in the Lead for Neighborhood program. I worked with the city for quite a while, including helping them found their sustainability office. But by nature, I was a bit too much of an entrepreneur, I think, and I was feeling restless, so I opened my own consulting firm. Over a period of time, we grew that consulting firm from just a couple of us to 45 people in one of the larger planning firms in Canada, and then we sold it. And I moved over into the real estate development industry, which is where a lot of these perspectives come from. I've helped start and am president of, like many people, any number of small organizations and non-governmental organizations that move the health agenda and other agendas forward in the public realm. And finally, I'm also an adjunct professor at Vancouver Island University at the moment, and am looking at these points of view and working with individuals from a number of universities in trying to get a better handle on the very, very broad and growing realm of academic studies and linkages between health and urban form, and what do we actually do about it. So the perspective you're going to hear from me is slightly different than many others because I've chosen to sit at many different seats at the table over time, and that can be frustrating. It also provides a unique perspective on why things fail sometimes. A couple other observations. Over my life in as a planner over many years, I've discovered that motherhoods are often quite ineffective. They're very important as an initial conversation and where we go. But beyond the scale of motherhoods, when we begin to get close to actually what it takes to build something differently, they become rather ineffective. And so part of this conversation is the story or an exploration of how we take these very important motherhoods, but actually drive them down into actual real physical change. I also need to note just one thing, that I personally believe that health is the next big thing in community development. We did sustainability for many years, and that included many, many different things. But the focus of trying to save the world through neighborhood development is both important and untenable in some ways, because human nature is not such that it will deny itself really key things that it wants and needs in order to save some amorphous thing we call the world, particularly species on another continent. And so what I think we're doing now is we're really taking many of the progressive agendas that we all want to see in communities and really drawing them together to our own personal, economic, social, and emotional health in our social context. So I believe that this conversation is absolutely on the front line of what needs to be done in in our communities today. Now, the Healthy Built Environment Toolkit is a really critical piece to this, and it's really the starting point. It's the trailhead for all of this. It's really, in some ways, the map of where we need to go. It really focuses on 4 areas. One is how a community is laid out, as in what do you do on any given piece of land, better known what we call land use patterns. So the need to create, the toolkit really focuses on the rationale and the ideas around creating complete communities where you can work and live and shop and eat and play and pray all in really the closest physical proximity possible. There's many benefits to that, social, economic, environmental benefits. It is definitely the way to go. Now, it's a lot easier said than done in many cases, but the toolkit provides an excellent basis on which to start this journey in that area. Its connected one then, of course, is mobility, in how all the different land uses are connected through transportation. Historically, we offloaded a lot of that, certainly in the 20th century, increasingly onto the private vehicle, and created, one of the biggest economic sectors in the world in fuel and vehicles. But going forward, the unintended consequences of that around climate emissions and its actual physical impact on having to create so many roads, and the financial impact on communities, is now really pushing us toward pedestrian, cyclist, transit, and if we do need to move around in vehicles, they're really clean and non-polluting vehicles. The health impacts of this are numerous. Your 30 minutes of exercise a day that you need to get to just basically maintain good health. If you don't get that from moving around as part of your day, then you have to take time out of your day and your family and your work in order to get that in some other hypothetical environment. So this becomes one of the other key cornerstones. The third one is housing. This speaks to the importance of the need for a long-term stable place to live as you go through stages of your life, because that helps maintain your social networks, and it's actually critical for business as well, because there's many different businesses required to create a complete community, and they all need different kinds of workers and customers, and as such the housing structure really becomes in some ways the habitat of a city. So a diversity of housing, trying to use whatever tools are necessary to battle back general market forces which tend to drive housing. There's many reasons why it drives housing up, but it tends to relentlessly drive housing costs up. And then finally noting that as we become more aware of the different accessibility needs, we have a need to change some of our traditional housing forms to be more accessible. The final of the big 4 cornerstones of the toolkit is the importance of outdoor green space, parks, greenways, gardens, trees. The physical benefits of living around these is absolutely statistically proven, and they really they have many benefits, not just to our health, but also to the ecological health, the diversity of species that are there, and really the long-term flexibility and the ability of a community to live together in a place. So these 4 are fantastic cornerstones. What you'll see in the note at the bottom of the slide there, though, is from my experience, I've found that we really need to get to a higher level of detail on all of these if we're actually going to achieve their final goals, because there's many things that will stop us achieving those goals. So I'd like to go to the next discussion first, which is to set the stage on how we implement these is different in whether we're working in a big city or a small town. So in a big city, you'll have a very large bureaucracy and planning department that is involved. Lots of experts, lots of voices. I think the planning department in the city of Vancouver, when I worked there, was hundreds of people. The planning department in the small community that I'm working in right now as a real estate developer is 1 person part-time. And as such, the scale of capacity that a community brings to implement the complexity of healthy design is really quite remarkably different between a big and a small town. Concurrently, the scale of policies and plans that they actually have in place, the amount of thinking that they've done, and the approvals that they've got in place for these initiatives likewise varies. A small town very typically has few big issues to deal with. They don't spend time developing policies. They don't have the money to do studies. There's very little resources available. Whereas in a big city, you can trace, if you look at, say, a housing policy for a large city, if you look at the history of it, you'll find housing discussions and adopted policies dating back decades and decades and decades, and increasingly becoming more sophisticated. There's many groups, commissions, stakeholders, an enormous amount of social capital in a big city, typically very few in a small town. However, those that you have tend to be very partisan and very highly opinionated. So the dynamic of working between these two, the political basis between a big city or a small town is quite different. In a big city, design is everything. when you're fitting that many people and that much of a complex economy into a very small space, every single square inch is carefully designed. Typically, smaller towns are much less dense, and there's many fewer conflicts per square foot, and so design just typically doesn't matter. And again, the resources, capacity, and even the finances in a development process or in any homeowner, they really aren't there to pay a lot of attention to design issues. Big cities are expensive. Small towns tend to be much less expensive. Conversely, there's also a lot less profit in play to pay for extra studies, to pay for better design, to pay for change. In big cities, the majority of the effort that is happening in new development or development at all is infill. You're taking down an existing building, you're transforming an existing land use that's surrounded by other users, and you're fitting in something new. In a small city, there's very little infill that actually occurs, or in a small town. Most all of it is greenfield. You're moving on to the next empty lot. Or there may be an old farm that was in the middle of the town, and now it's no longer a farm, so you tend to be building on brand new greenfield land. The infill process is more challenging. It's much easier in a greenfield environment to come up with new and innovative ways to do things because you don't have to fit into where the existing pipes and roads and infrastructure are. So different range of opportunities there. And finally, large cities generally have a very high level of sophistication. You'll be dealing with development managers who have 10 years of post-secondary education is not uncommon for a development manager. In a small town, there are almost no developers. Most of them are home builders. They may buy a piece of land and do a subdivision, but they really aren't what we would call a large-scale developer with a sophisticated group of staff who can grapple with difficult problems. And as such, the recommendations you make for making something healthy have to make sense to someone who may have just barely graduated from high school or not even graduated from high school and simply started in construction and ultimately became a successful home builder. And as such, the conversation is quite different. To move to the next level then, as we move forward in how to take our motherhoods and our general goals that we have in our toolkit and operationalize them in these two environments, what we find is that actually the scale of planning and approvals work is fairly similar. It's just how it actually plays itself out is a little different. So this is what I call the Russian doll of city plans and approvals. It's this nested hierarchy that starts at an overall city plan or an overall community plan. Now these are generally encouraged, not mandated in the province of BC, less so in other communities, but most communities try and get together and they figure out, and they update it every few years, what do we want the whole town to look like or the whole city to look like? So they'll set aside big areas for industrial use and residential use of different types and identify where an urban core and where the town centers need to be and where the major transportation routes are going to be. Then they move to the next layer of discussions, which happens in two ways. One is an overarching policy initiative, which might say something like, it might be an overarching policy for parks, and there'll be a whole parks plan for the community independent of the OCP or the community plan. And then they'll break down into the next layer of detail, which is they'll take entire neighborhoods or large developable areas, and they'll do what we call an area structure plan or a neighborhood plan or a local area plan for those. Similar topics to the official community plan, just to the next layer of detail. As you lay out a town or a city, certain big corridors emerge. So if we think about Vancouver, for instance, there are some major corridors that exist, such as the Broadway corridor, which connects the entire city east to west. From one end to the other has UBC at one end, which is the 6th largest population sub-area in the entire province. At one end, and it goes through some of the most important areas of the city going back. So you'll end up with a Broadway corridor plan, or more recently a Cambie corridor plan in Vancouver, where they invested billions of dollars in infrastructure and need to make sure that that investment in transit really plays itself out in the housing area. Once you get past that, every single square foot of a city is zoned. And so you'll go down to, which determines basically what uses and general envelope of development can happen. And so you then start working on zoning within these larger plans to determine exactly what should happen on any given parcel of land. The agreements for zoning are generally accommodated by or accompanied by a phased development agreement, which is where the municipality and the landowner or the developer agree to what rights are going to be given and in what sequence in exchange for what public goods as development proceeds. Either before, during, or after the zoning process, we'll do a subdivision, which is to take a larger parcel and break it into smaller parcels as part of the overall site plan or the neighborhood plan that we're trying to do. Then development finally begins to proceed. On any given parcel, the applicant or the developer will ask for a development permit, and that has to show the design of the project and meet a bunch of checklists depending on what kind of a site you're working on, and ultimately they get permission and begin to build. Before they build, they have to do detailed designs of the landscape and the buildings, and they get their building permit, and then they can build. So what you can see immediately from this list is that we're working from a very high level of detail to a very low level of detail throughout this process. What's important for the toolkit is the toolkit is primarily aimed at the top 5 areas of this. And even at the scale of zoning, it just really barely touches some of those issues. So if we're going to implement the toolkit's agendas, we need to then take its cornerstones, its goals, and figure out how they need to be taken through all these next steps. And so how that works is looks sort of like this. We need to identify the higher level goals and aspirations, which are well covered in the toolkit and many other documents. We then need to take them down into more specific policies that address things like transportation, that address housing, that address parks. We then need to apply those policies into the next lower levels of scale, so the area structure plans, the actual site development plans and zoning. There's a piece of work that fits into this called guidelines. They're used in different ways in different communities on every different project, but they tend to, what their goal is to give instructions that take the big macro policies and visions. They give instructions to the detailed design of buildings, sidewalks, parks, any of these individual pieces to establish exactly what should be done. These become design details in the actual construction process and design process, and ultimately in many cases we need to actually adopt some formal legal regulations to lock the requirement to do these in order to ensure they happen, because sometimes they cost a bit more, sometimes they're a new way of doing things, and the existing market forces will push back against them unless there's a regulation to do that. Now at each one of those stages we're going to go through, there's a whole process you have to go through. There's multiple jurisdictions of all 3 levels of government as well as other government agencies that have a play, and they all have their own policies and rules, and we have to go through an approval as we move through this process. And so the goal of an environmental health officer in this process now, I want to bring that onto the table now, because a lot of the future of the health authorities in BC, as they wade directly into this discussion about the relationship between environments and population health, that conversation is now increasingly going to be on the environmental health officer and the medical health officer's desk, which is a new role, which EHOs have not typically had in the past in their focus on largely basic health and safety. And so what I want to talk through now is give you a little more information about each of these stages and exactly how an environmental health officer can engage that conversation. So let's go for the first one, which is an official community plan. And what you see in the upper right is a typical, what a map of maybe an official community plan might look like. It shows different color patterns that show the different uses, and you can see immediately some corridors and a certain network, and you can see the park pattern, and there'll be policies around each of these. So a typical OCP will have a map like that. It'll include some general policies for these different areas. It'll talk about this general spatial pattern of land use and transportation and green space and other big patterns. And it will clearly establish the community's aspirational goals of what they're going to try and achieve. So in terms of how to get involved, an environmental health officer or a health authority is typically has easy access into these conversations, and they can actually achieve a certain status upon request of a special participant that needs to have extra time spent on what they think and what they think should happen. You can make presentations as part of the OCP process. You can write a formal submission or comments on the drafts as the OCP evolves through a number of drafts. The Hve Toolkit is an excellent toolkit to start with this. You don't really need much more than to bring the toolkit to the stage, and in some ways I would argue the toolkit's best focus is at this stage, at setting really the larger trajectory for the community. When we go to the next piece that I talked about around a whole series of policies, these again will be about any topic. They can be very technical around, something around infrastructure design or housing design, or they may be very broad spread like a sustainable food policy agenda or something like this. Really where they tend to show up a lot from the conversation today is some communities are pursuing healthy city plans or healthy community plans, where they're really taking the health issues and bringing them into the healthy community discussion directly under that title. Now, these policies will affect the whole city. So again, the involvement of an EHO or a health authority is in a very similar way. You become a special participant, you make presentations during the policy development process, submissions, comments. The toolkit is, again, the first place to start for your resources and how to respond to any of these issues, but you will need to do some more research into other areas. Academics have been doing a lot of research in the last 20 years through the population health determinants studies on how certain components of cities affect population health. And so you're going to need to respond to those. You're going to need to probably find some special, do some more original research to further flesh out what's in the toolkit to help you deal with those. When we move to the neighborhood scale, again, through local area plans or district plans, and you can see the one up here. This is the one for the Olympic Village. I showed you an image of that process before. I spent nearly 10 years of my life in different roles working on that, and that map changed I don't know how many times during that period of time, quite radically in some cases. How the streets were structured, how the blocks were structured, what land uses went where, what parks were there. We received submissions from many different groups over the years to how big the park should be, how many houses should be there. So right now it's ink on paper at this stage, and so it's very flexible and many different things can be explored. Again, the health authority needs to step as a special participant, or in this case, they're often an actual formal referral agency. So you will get sent the draft plan for a local area or a district plan, and you can comment on it. So between presentations, evaluations, submissions, and comments, you have a very, very strong foundation on which to get at this conversation and influence it. The toolkit still includes many good uses and many good pieces of advice for how to do this. And again, you're going to want to do maybe some additional levels of research and detail in certain areas that catch your attention. What's going to come out of it? You'll be commenting on visions, policies, and the general layout process. You're going to look at a more detail of where the housing and the commercial and the industrial and parks areas, the land use patterns, transportation, the character, and the kinds of services that would probably be here. So at this scale, if you do want health services to be located in the neighborhood for whatever reason, let's say if we're looking at the downtown east side in Vancouver, there's a range of social services required to meet the social needs of that community. That is when you need to do this, is to begin to take that process forward into that dynamic. The next layer of detail is going to be similar to a local area plan, but it's one of these linear ones that I talked about, really a corridor or a very special area. Very similar topics you'll talk about. There'll be a vision, there's going to be some general policies, and a structure for it. The issues in a special area plan are various, and they depend on why you're doing this. If it's a transit corridor, there'll be a lot about transit and housing. If it's a special heritage area, it'll be all heritage. If it's a socially challenged area like the downtown east side in Vancouver, there'll be a very complex range of social issues related to it. University campus, its hospital precinct, etc. Again, you need to establish yourself as a health authority or an EHO as a special participant, submissions, comments, and presentations. Your toolkit will help. But again, on the specific issues, you're going to want to do some additional research into other documents, other organizations, other academic research that will affect this directly. Moving to zoning. Now, I'm going to argue that there's a case to be made that zoning may be one of the most important pieces of this process. And the reason why is fairly simple. It's through zoning that we take what is generally a policy positive encouragement approach to planning, and we move into the legal realm, which essentially starts to lock things in and lock things out. And so the zoning dynamic there is really key. So what you're going to be working at here now is a very detailed land use map of the actual parcels that are involved. You're going to be looking at very detailed land use regulations that cover height, envelope, parking standards, many different uses, density, primarily density, setbacks, exactly how the site is laid out. A lot of this comes to play in zoning, as well as all of the uses that cannot happen there. Zoning essentially is a process for excluding uses. So it will define what's allowed and, more importantly, what's not allowed. The form and character will be shaped, and a lot of the base transportation demand from the parking guidelines will also impact this. So again, as an EHO or health authority, establish yourself as a key participant. You will be by law a referral agency. The issue with being a referral agency at this stage is by the time you get the draft zoning, most of the work's been done. And because you don't actually have a regulatory hammer over the municipality, you're a commenting agency through the referral process. You'll be commenting on largely at the end of the process, And if everyone, by then most everyone's bought into it, and so if you see big troubles with it, there's likely to be maybe some response, but no robust response to your concern. So you're far wiser to get involved as possible at the very beginning of this process where you can make some direct comments on the area. Now, the Hve Toolkit is good, in this case, when you look at a large enough piece of land that has a whole network of issues of housing and land use and transportation and green space. But in many cases, it's actually a little bit high level for this. So at this point, at what is possibly the most important stage of land use regulation and control, the Hve Toolkit begins to become slightly less valuable, and we begin to need a lot more specific information on the connections of health and how a place is built in order to make the case to make changes on that. So that'll involve a bit of extra research. Concurrent with the zoning, if a person is rezoning a site, the community will take on a phased development agreement. Now, this is going to be an agreement between the developer and the city. It's going to look at the rights of the developer, the rights of the city, the responsibilities they each have, and most importantly, the timing. This is why it's called a phased development agreement. So the developer may agree to provide a community center and a daycare and a park and a waterfront walkway and outdoor recreation equipment, etc. But they can't provide them all on day one because there's no bank would lend them the money because they spend too much and they don't have any revenue coming in to service the debt. And so what you end up doing is agreeing that say, well, I'll provide you the plaza on day one, but the waterfront walkway comes on year 3. The outdoor equipment comes on year 5 because I actually have to build and sell enough condos and retail space in order to actually have enough profit to be able to put that in, because if we put it in at the wrong time, then nothing gets built because no bank will lend you money to do it because there's not the financial pro forma doesn't work. Again, so the issue here is that the health authority needs to become really a special advisor to the municipality on what to ask for. These phased development agreements are a big horse trading process, and what the community asks for depends on what advice they're getting. They'll default ask for the usual things, which are often very good, parks and other public facilities. But if the health authority feels that there are some other issues that really are needed in the area, for instance, if you're in a food desert and you need some food supplies, or you think urban agriculture is critical, or there's a very large seniors population that needs some seniors facilities, very wise for the health authority to get involved early on and discuss with the municipality what would be in the public interest to ask for from the developer, because it's a zero-sum game. There's only so much value the developer can give the community, and where it's spent is where it's spent, and it can't be spent on more than what it can cover. This moves far beyond the Hve Toolkit. So now we're down into very specific lists of needs. We're into much more detailed relationships of neighborhoods and what is needed for healthy. So clarity on requests is really key. Who pays, who benefits, and what timing. If the health authority can bring some resources through their capital plans to this, or if they intend to own some of the facilities, the developer may be able to spend some of their community amenity money with the municipal government and the health authority as partners to create some important health facilities. But again, as you can see, the health authority or the EDO will need to be at the table very early on in this process with some detailed assumptions and needs. Concurrent with this process, we'll break a larger piece of land into a bunch of small pieces. Here you can see a typical subdivision plan in the upper right. Now, the subdivision plan you see in the upper right has something that many health designers are a little concerned about, and that is known as the cul-de-sac, which essentially closes off a street and makes it really much more car dependent than pedestrian oriented, depending on how the trail network is designed. It's at this stage that you need to make comment on it. Now, a health authority actually is a formal regulatory review authority with the ability to, in some ways, stop a project by forbidding the extension of a water supply line into a piece of land. So this has been traditionally your biggest hammer. Ironically, it actually is one of the stages where there's the least impact on health, other than where parks are located and what kind of street network you're using. Not insignificant, but not that big. So at this stage, you'll need to wade into the site planning layout. This is exactly what subdivision is for. Where do the lots go? How big are they? Where the roads go? How big are they? How are they connected? Where are the parks? How is all the servicing occurring, etc. And so this happens in a municipality through a subdivision authority and not through the council regulatory or political approving processes. This is a non-political technical approving process done with a simple senior staff member who's got the approving authority mandate. This is, again, far beyond the Hve Toolkit in most cases and involves some more detailed understanding in the EDO and the health authority of how land use patterns through a subdivision process affect health. It needs to be done fairly early on. These subdivision processes have huge rules already around them, exactly how a lot can be designed and what its shape should be, how wide streets should be. They're already approved in the subdivision bylaw at a provincial level, and so some of the things the health authority might want to see may in fact contravene the subdivision bylaw. We had a joke in the early days in my sustainability chapter of my profession that sustainability was excellent and what everybody wanted, except that the majority of it was illegal. This is the case in point where sometimes you find that. You want a narrower road to service an area, or you want more pedestrian infrastructure, or you don't want cul-de-sacs, or you want some other things that are less car dependent. Subdivision bylaw may actually get in the way of that. Not always, but it becomes a very detailed technical layout discussion that would be very valuable for EDOs and health authorities to begin to develop more toolkit-like resources for you when you engage a developer and a municipality in a subdivision process. So once we've got everything zoned, we've got the subdivision done, we know what we can do on each individual parcel, then the developer is going to come forward with a development permit. And here you see in the upper right hand something that's quite like what a development permit is going to look like. It's going to be it's going to have some basic building massing. It's going to have setbacks designed. It's going to talk about the actual skin, the general facade of the buildings, etc. Sometimes the development permit is much less than this. It's just going to be to convey a geotech report to ensure a house can be built. But in any urban environment, it generally goes to a much more level of detail of building massing, how shadows are going to be dealt with, where transit stops are going to be located, etc. And so the Hve Toolkit provides you with a good basis on how to approach this, but does not provide a whole lot of detail. Your role as an EDO or health authority representative in this is going to be, again, as a special participant in the design process. So contributing detailed policy ideas or design guidelines that you think are critical, and then engaging in the design process, which is very iterative. You create a draft and you refine it and you evaluate it, you take it apart and take a different tack on it. It's a very iterative process. Unfortunately, most of it happens behind closed doors in an architect or site planner's office, and it comes into the municipality. So you're going to need to get a special status with that municipality through workshops and what we might call a design charrette or a design workshop, where you can come to the table with the designers and the developer and the municipality and really talk through the details of any of these if there are some key health issues that you want to address. This is mostly handled by senior staff. It will often go to council for approval, but in some cases in a big city it doesn't. It stays within the staff department for approval unless it's something extremely political and they want to bring staff into it. Now at this stage, the detailed site design issues and the cost become critical. The project is far enough along that the developer will already have a very good sense of what they think that they can afford to spend, and the financing may already be in place for that budget. So if we start asking for things that are too expensive, the whole thing will fall apart. You'll get an enormous amount of pushback, and it'll get very politicized very quickly. So a gentle and respectful approach, a creative approach of trying to help the designers understand what you see the health issues are and how ideas for how to respond to them. This takes a certain measure of humility and openness and engagement with that process. Now that culture is not the culture of a regulatory agency, and as such, when we get to this level of detail, an EDO needs to take a deep breath, put on the cloak of humility, and come in as a co-participant rather than the regulator that distrusts, that is constantly having to be a gatekeeper of actors in the process. So this requires the health authority and the EDO to take on put on a different hat, wear some different clothes, and engage the discussion in a different way. The next discussion here then is around the next layer of detail, which is a building permit. At this point, we're talking about very detailed building design guidelines, and the discussion around what that building is going to look like at a construction level of design detail. Basically, we're drawing the blueprints that are going to be handed to the contractor now to build them. That's where we get into the detail inside of the building or into the specifics of absolute any given square foot of land in a landscape environment. There is very little involvement for a health authority or an EDO in this process. It becomes simply the interaction between a building inspector and the architect or the landscape architect through the developer. And in many cases, in a smaller community, the plans that are being put forward are designed at best by a technologist, and in some cases, they're literally house plans ordered over the, ordered from some house plan supplier. So there's very, very little detail in this process that we can get involved in. It's way far past the Hve Toolkit, and what's important for the health authorities in this case is it's the building code that determines this. Determines all the activities, the actions, and the outcomes at this stage. And so working with the provincial government and their building code people, their building code approvals and updating commissions is really an important way to get at this process. It's very hard to get at the building permit stage of any individual project, but if you can change the building code, then every building that is built will meet your health goals. So moving here then into the last few slides, you can see that there's this sort of stage of processes which occurs in levels of detail, which has to happen. The high scale plans and policies, OCPs, neighborhood area plans, etc. The toolkit is excellent. The role of the EDO or the health authority is as an advisor and an educator to many of the players on really what the goals and policies need to be for where we're going, because these are aspirational and large macro plans. The mid-scale of the discussion we had here was around the zoning, the phase development agreements, and the subdivision process. At that point, we're now on an individual piece of land. We're shaping what can happen, exactly what the parcel of land is, the unique layout of that area for its streets and its uses and its parks. The Hve Toolkit is an excellent starting point, but you will want to do more work on the specific issues and more research on the specific issues at play, and you're going to want to take a more active role. You're going to need to find your way into the workshop tables, the municipal review process in a very shirt sleeves up, hands-on process in order to engage the discussion, find where the details are occurring, provide advice, and try and get as much good, healthy design as possible. The last scale, development permit and building permit, much more difficult for a health authority or an EDO to get involved in. It's code reviews, it's detailed building design, detailed landscape design, and the toolkit really offers very little support for you in that, so you're going to need to do some more research into that process. As an EDO or as a health authority then, as you look at that stages of involvement, just a few thoughts on how to be effective. And many of these are ones that you'll be familiar with from needing to work with other agencies at any given time. There is a policy perspective that is required. It's not just regulations. Typically, many environmental health officers are really it's a compliance-oriented regulatory role that many of the health authorities play vis-a-vis municipalities and development. This approach to health requires you to get past that, to get into a more of a vision and a policy orientation and not just implementing somebody else's regulations. You need to work with the municipality to in some ways come up with new ones to help them figure out how to adapt them. There's a lot of relationship building and education of yourself and education of your colleagues in municipalities and development organizations in a gentle, easygoing way, showing them how it's in their interest, what benefits, what's in it for them to do something that's more healthy. You need to be able to clarify the health objectives and specifics in a very, very clear way so that people understand, because when we talk about healthy community issues, they tend to come out as motherhoods, and someone who spends their day dealing with building permits, they can't make the leap. In some ways, their personality is going to be one more of a concrete thinker. It's got to be real factual and very real, and they have a very hard time taking an abstract idea such as active transportation and figuring out what it means to them. They don't do that work. It takes a health authority working with planners and strategists and designers and municipal staff to go, what do we mean by active transportation, or let's help everybody get 30 minutes of good exercise a day, down to the design of a specific sidewalk. That becomes the nature of this transition. And so being able to take your ideas and make them specific in a friendly way, really critical. A lot of humility is needed because actually there are whole people's livelihoods, codes of ethics, professional standards, and an enormous amount of money at stake. And Like in a development process of any big neighborhood, you're going to end up with dozens of fully qualified professionals, each of them needed just to deal with a small piece of it. If you look at the number of types of engineers there are in the world, it's quite amazing. And on a big project, you can easily hire 5 to 10 different types of engineers to look at all the different issues. That's how detailed and how complex this is. So coming in as a generalist, promoting health, requires a lot of humility and a real desire and ability to collaborate with someone from a completely different profession and learn how they're looking at things, at what their issues are, and then getting them to understand a little more about what the health implications could be, and then working together to find a better outcome. I think it's important to leverage the health medical factor. A medical health officer is not someone you pick a disagreement with. The MD factor that a health authority brings to a table is very powerful, and it's one of your strongest bases on which to respond. Even if the environmental health officer is not an MD, that's not common that is the case, but you're backed by an enormous amount of medical science, and bringing that sense of authority to the table is an important, not something you want to play heavily, but it's a very important base of credibility. And then finally, the politics are critical. And, you know, in a democratic society, politics define everything that isn't an absolute regulation, and even then it can affect those. So learning to build relationships with the mayors, with the staff, with the counselors, getting them to like you and help move this forward is really key. I think one of the best examples we've seen here, this is 2016, and in the last few years, some of the best examples we've seen has been, say, the work of Pam Moore from the Interior Health Authority and a few of her colleagues and some of the other health authorities. They've built an enormous amount of credibility in the field. And when they come and they talk about issues, they know how to do it, they know how to get people to work with them, and they've had a big impact on a lot of us in our business from interacting with them. So in conclusion, what we've covered here today is we've looked at sort of the stages of design and approvals that take place to create a community, and then we've talked about the general dimensions and a general way that an environmental health officer or a health authority can engage that process, which traditionally has actually had very few points of impact with a development or a planning environment. We're in a new world of bringing them together, so we've talked about ideas and strategies around how you can do that. There's new issues. We're still working with a lot of old languages and solutions, many of them locked into law. So this is going to require patience. It's a whole new role for environmental health officers. It requires new ways of thinking, new ways of being. You're engaging policy and design and details that aren't typically part of the role and the responsibility. And yet society needs health officers to wade into this conversation. It's a big room when you get into these processes. There's a lot of players. It's pretty compact. It's regulated in many ways. Some of the players are cowboys, and they're going to try and disrupt things, both from a developer point of view or from an activist point of view. There's always disruptive forces. I used to educate the folks who work with me about the concept of long toes. When you're in a room with lots of long toes, you have to be careful with you step, because you're probably going to step on a toe, because they reach a long ways. And so it takes a humility and a collaborative approach to step on as few toes as possible while you're getting as many health objectives met. You need to focus on articulating risks and advantages, combination, but backing it up with data in a very neutral way. And you're going to win some of those battles, and you're going to lose some of those battles. But the bottom line is, as you work to not create offense in the process, so you get to stay in the battle and ultimately win the war. It's a bit of a martial metaphor, but it's really critical, because in many cases the deck will be stacked against you, and you need to go, okay, we're not going to win this one. We may have to go around and do something else. We may actually have to go and work on changing the building code, because I can't actually change this project in that issue. Continue to build your own knowledge base, continue to build your own credibility, and over time you will build your influence. And again, I hats off to many of the people who've been really the trailblazers like Pam Moore and others in this field and health authorities in BC. They've really built a lot of credibility, and that means when they say something, we take them very seriously, and we will roll up our sleeves and go, I'm not going to challenge that that's true. Now the question is, how do we go about doing something about it? And the last point I want to make in this is that there's a very, very big difference between government time, and that includes public health authority time, and development time. We have the old saying that time is money, and in a development project, time is money. And the project I'm on right now, we pay $11,000 a week in interest for a mortgage that we hold on half the property. So if it takes 3 weeks to have a meeting and get an engagement with a health officer because they've stepped in and said, I really have a huge problem with something that's happening here, and the municipality says, okay, we got to deal with the health authority, that's going to be over $30,000 just in interest holding costs for me for that 3-week delay. Whereas a 3-week delay, 3 weeks between meetings in a government environment that's actually a fairly fast scheduled meeting from my experience in government. And so trying extra hard to be responsive, having systems, having information resources available, and being very timely as much as possible will be a key part of this interface between the public interest and the private necessities of the marketplace in how we build our communities and how we build our housing and how we move forward. I'll stop there. I hope that this has given you a sense of the complexity of what has to happen to build the home that you lived in, the building that you work in, the places that you shop in, that your children go to school in. This is a process that basically takes place every time anything is built in our communities. Making our communities healthier is non-negotiable. We must do this. And it's going to be a story in the next chapter of time of how health authorities and environmental health officers insert themselves into this process. And if we can do this right and we can build the toolkits to make this happen, we can create communities that will make people healthier and healthier simply because they live there, rather than finding ourselves in the situation of a healthcare system that has an overload of having to deal with chronic disease problems because we built our communities in the wrong way. So we're entering a new golden age, a new chapter of opportunity in building healthy communities. And I thank you for the opportunity to talk to you about this.